So picking up with our next section for this unit, we are now beginning, this is really two sections right here that you see labeled on this slide. It says the Age of Jackson and Reform. So these are the last two sections of Unit 4. So remember I said it was 6 sections. The fifth one is the Jacksonian era, the presidency of Andrew Jackson. And then the last one is the first reform movement in the United States. So we'll cover that later on. So let's get started with Andrew Jackson. So we've talked a little bit about Andrew Jackson before, and we're going to talk about him in a lot more detail as well as his presidency during this section of the unit. So Andrew Jackson's nickname was actually Old Hickory. He got that nickname because, he was supposedly stood strong and immovable on the battlefield. He had that reputation from when he was a general in the American military, and we talked about him back during the War of 1812. So Andrew Jackson is elected president on he's elected president in November. He is inaugurated as president on March 4th in 1829. So you see that down here, the first Capitol inauguration, 1829. So a lot of people really, really loved Andrew Jackson for many reasons. He was, a war hero, and he was a self-made man. Andrew Jackson is really the epitome of the American dream, and I'll tell you a little bit about him so that you know that, so you know why. Andrew Jackson was born actually possibly in North Carolina. He was born really essentially in Waxhaw, which is a little south of Charlotte, and if you know anything about Charlotte, you know that we're not necessarily south of Charlotte. I guess it's sort of east of Charlotte, but Waxhaw is right, Charlotte is right on the border of North Carolina and South Carolina, and Waxhaw is, it's in North Carolina now, but the place where Andrew Jackson was born, North Carolina and South Carolina both claim that back then was part of their state. So he was maybe born here, maybe born in South Carolina. Either way, whatever, who cares? So he was born in, basically a barn to a relatively poor family. His father died before he was even born. After he was born, he was born to a mom, and I think he had 2 brothers. Yeah, he had 2 brothers, and his mom. It was just the 4 of them. And he grew up during the American Revolution, so when he was young, and during the American Revolution, they would hire, the Patriots would hire small children who knew the land very well to deliver messages between American regiments, between our military units. And Andrew Jackson and his brothers were one of those, a couple of those kids hired for that purpose. And they would deliver messages back and forth between the United States troops. And at one point, one night when they were delivering a message, his older brother was shot and killed by a British officer because he was delivering a message to the Americans. So at that point, Andrew Jackson, really hates Great Britain. He hates everything that there is to do with Great Britain. A little bit after that, a few years later, his mother, or his brother, actually, his other brother got, I think, scarlet fever or something like that. He got some disease, and while his mother was taking care of him, she got it, and they both died. So before Andrew Jackson was even 8 years old, his entire family had died, and it was only him left. So Andrew Jackson moved I think to around where Salisbury is, and he got a job. He worked through school. He got a job as like a clerk at a store, and managed to put himself through law school in North Carolina. And eventually, after he finished law school, he enlisted in the military, where we know he fought in the War of 1812. After that, he moved to Tennessee, and when he was in Tennessee, he was elected to he helped, get the state of Tennessee, and, to become a state, basically. He helped it move from territory to state, and he was elected to some city government when he was in Tennessee, and then later on worked his way up to be a congressman, and that's how he, got his foot into the political arena. So he went from being a poor, homeless orphan at 8 years old to being the president of the United States in 1829, which is very, very impressive. He was a very strong, stern dude. I'll tell you one more story. So his wife actually was married before she was married to Andrew Jackson, and her husband, I guess, was kind of like a turd, and he was just never really around, and he sort of left her, and so she wanted a divorce, but he wasn't around to divorce her, and so she sort of left him back and married Andrew Jackson with it. And he was cool with it. Her first husband was like, whatever. But because she was technically married to a man before she was married to Andrew Jackson and never really divorced him, some people called her a bit of a slut. And, one time Andrew Jackson was in some bar and some guy was like whispering, and he's like, Andrew Jackson's wife's a hoe. And Andrew Jackson's like, hey, say that to my face. And he's like, all right, your wife is a hoe. So Andrew Jackson's like, all right, I'm challenging you to a duel. So he duels this guy, and you remember I was talking about duels before with Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. The person who is challenged to the duel fires first, and then the challenger fires. So the guy that Andrew Jackson challenges to a duel, he fires first. He shoots Andrew Jackson in the chest. Andrew Jackson just sort of shakes it off and fires at this guy and kills him. And Andrew Jackson lived the rest of his life with a bullet in his chest that he got from this duel. He served his whole presidency with a bullet in his chest. So you can see why people liked him. He was definitely an interesting guy, the epitome of the American dream, a self-made man, like I said. So we've now see the Democratic Party has emerged in the United States. The name is the same. It's technically the same party as the Democratic Party today, only you should not associate them, really. The issues were way different. The people were way different. But Andrew Jackson was a Democrat. So he was really supported by a lot of poor people. Poor people loved Andrew Jackson, and so a lot of poor people came out to see him inaugurated here. So Andrew Jackson didn't actually run for president for the first time in 1828. He previously ran for president in 1829, and Andrew Jackson had a lot of trust issues. He didn't trust Great Britain, and he didn't trust big government, which is sort of ironic because he's going to be the epitome of big government, but we'll get there. So in 1824, when he ran for president, he won the popular vote, but not the electoral vote. And Henry Clay supported John Quincy Adams for president, and that gave Henry Clay's support gave John Quincy Adams the electoral votes that he needed to win the presidency. So in 1824, John Quincy Adams was elected president instead of Andrew Jackson, and Andrew Jackson thought that Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams may have made some sort of side arrangement that in exchange for Henry Clay's support, Adams would give him a job. And then as soon as Adams became president, he did give Henry Clay a job. He made him his new Secretary of State. So Andrew Jackson called this the corrupt bargain. This is known as the corrupt bargain. In exchange for votes, I'll give you a job. That's very illegal. We don't actually know if it happened or not, but Andrew Jackson certainly thought that it did. So when we talk about Andrew Jackson, it's important to talk about Jacksonian democracy. And Jacksonian democracy, we've already sort of alluded to a little bit. Jacksonian democracy is the expansion of voting rights during Jackson's presidency. So we see the type of people who are allowed to vote is going to change. Now, I don't mean women can now vote, and I don't mean that people who aren't white can now vote. It's still just white men. But there are no longer restrictions about, wealth or land ownership or things like that. So really, for the first time, poor people can vote, and those people are going to be voting for Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson also, as a part of Jacksonian democracy, institutes something called the spoils system. So the spoils system is essentially where you put all of your friends into really cushy jobs in the government. So Andrew Jackson gets into the White House, and he has a bunch of executive department positions to fill. Who's he going to put in there? Is he going to put people who are qualified for the job, or is he going to fill it with a bunch of his friends? Andrew Jackson decides to fill it with a bunch of his friends. So he replaced 1 in 10 people. He started firing people to make enough room for all of his friends that he wanted to give a job. 1 in 10 of them he replaced with a supporter of his. So he faces a large amount of criticism for this. So when we talk about Andrew Jackson's presidency, there are really 3 big things that you should think about when you think about Andrew Jackson. You should think about Indian removal, number 1. You should think about the Bank War, number 2. And you should think about the nullification crisis, number 3. So right now we're going to start talking about Indian removal. So if you remember back to the War of 1812, that was the first time that Andrew Jackson had any interaction with Native Americans. He went to the South, remember, to make some negotiations to end the Creek War. So the Creek War was from 1813 to 1814, and it was between opposing Creek Indian factions in the Creek Confederation. So there was all these different Creek tribes who were all fighting with each other. Really, normally the American government wouldn't pay attention to intertribal warfare like this. Only some American settlers started to get killed in the crossfire, so they sent Andrew Jackson down there to handle the situation. So he meets with the Creek Confederation and forces them to sign the Treaty of Fort Jackson. You see him, this is a picture of him here meeting, a depiction, I guess, this isn't a real photograph, of him meeting with some Native Americans, some Creeks, to sign the Treaty of Fort Jackson. So in the Treaty of Fort Jackson, the Creek Indians are forced to give up 21 million acres of land, and he takes this from both sides of the Creeks, who are fighting each other, sort of as punishment for, having any Americans being killed in the crossfire. The argument that Jackson had was that Native Americans are a threat to the safety and security of the nation. And he said that if they weren't eventually moved away from white settlers, that the white settlers would turn on them and that they would kill all of the Native Americans. So in Andrew Jackson's mind, he says that it's for the best interest of the Native Americans that we move them out of where they are now to somewhere else. So there are 5 tribes that you need to know. I think we've talked about the 5 civilized tribes before. So you definitely need to write all of these down. You need to know each of these 5 civilized tribes. So the 5 civilized tribes are Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole. So I know it sounds like it's going to be hard to remember those, but it's really not. We'll go through each of them. So Cherokee, you should remember, because the Cherokee Native Americans, that's really what we have the most of around us here in North Carolina. So you've probably, it's possible that you've even been to a Cherokee powwow when you were in elementary school. That's a pretty common elementary school field trip. Choctaw and Chickasaw, you should remember both those. They kind of sound the same. They rhyme maybe a little bit. Remember the 2 of those together, Choctaw and Chickasaw. Creek, you should remember, because Andrew Jackson and his involvement in the Creek Wars and the Creek Indians, signing the Treaty of Fort Jackson. And then Seminole should be easy to remember because it's the only one that doesn't start with a C. And you can think of the Florida Seminoles, and you think of this. These Native Americans are living in Florida, which is why we have that sports team called the Florida Seminoles. So, the reason why we call these 5 tribes the 5 civilized tribes is because they had adopted a lot of aspects of American culture and European culture. These 5 tribes spoke primarily English. They lived in towns very similar to ours. They had their own writing systems. A lot of them even owned slaves. They lived on large plantations, especially the Cherokee. The Cherokee, I guess you would say, are the most similar to white culture. You can see the Choctaw guy here. He's in an outfit that looks really similar to what a white person would wear. So does the Creek and the Cherokee guy. So there were actually a lot of Cherokee people, especially, who owned slaves. But still a lot of white Americans viewed the Native Americans as inferior because, it's 1830 and everyone's racist. So, in Andrew Jackson's mind, like I said, he thinks that to help the Native Americans, we need to get them off of the land that they've lived on for hundreds of years, and we need to move them somewhere else, or the white people are going to kill them. So, in 1830, he signs the Indian Removal Act, and the Indian Removal Act creates an Indian territory. It's this red right here, and that's actually what is today, modern-day Oklahoma. So, this Indian territory is going to be created. We'll move all of the Native Americans off of all the land that you see is yellow, and that we'll move them onto that red land, the Indian reservations, and each of them will get a certain amount of land, which is equal, sort of, to the amount of land that they had previously, and they will be guaranteed that land. We'll sign treaties to make sure that everyone ends up with the same amount of land.